Hi, everyone. To the initiated, no explanation is necessary, and to the uninitiated, no explanation will suffice. This is actually an adaptation from a quote that says, to those who believe, no explanation is necessary. To those who do not believe, no explanation will suffice. So what does that mean? What is the pearl in that? It basically means that I'm going to get up here and I'm going to talk to you about these really deep experiences that I've had. And if you've never had a similar experience, it's going to be very difficult for the meat or the real wisdom to kind of penetrate your experience. So I'm going to do the very best I can to articulate a lot of these really deep insights, and thank you for coming along for the ride. The name of my talk today is 40 Heroic Doses and a Return to the Cave. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Travis Tyler Fluck, and I served as leadership on I-301. And after we decriminalized mushrooms here in Denver, I started taking the medicine path very seriously. And a few months ago, I realized that I had had 40 of these deep experiences since we decriminalized, and I feel like that's a really good place to really speak to from. The second part of the title is a return to the cave, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Plato's Allegory of the Cave and how it's relevant in my story, in my narrative, and the task of explaining these deep states to not only to myself, but to others. I have coined this term Autognostic Mycology. So the word autognosis is the mystery of self. So I utilize the study of mushrooms to explore the mystery of big S self, the self that we all are, and little s self, the Travis Tyler Fluck that I am. I've divided Autognostic Mycology into 9 different areas that I explore in. And the first is direct experience. I've been working with the mushrooms for 27 years now. And like I said, the last 3 years, I actually decided to take this very seriously. And I didn't realize in 24 years that I could actually go to the mushrooms with an intention or a focus, and it would begin a conversation, a dialogue. The next area that I operate in is cultivation, and I've been cultivating psilocybin mushrooms off and on for 20 years now. The third area I'm going to call support, because a lot of the words that we use to kind of like portray facilitation or holding space aren't shared definitions, and they really don't mean the same thing to everybody that steps up to this space. So I just like to talk about it in terms of support. Like I know nothing, but the very little that I do know, or let's back up a little bit. I know nothing, but what I do suppose, I am happy to share with anybody that is inclined to do this work. Education. So after we decriminalized mushrooms, I drove around with a flow hood, which is a piece of mycological equipment, and taught people how to cultivate in their homes. And what I learned in that process is that growing the medicine is just as important as communing or taking in the medicine. The fifth area here is activism. So I never likened myself an activist because I just never felt like I had a rooted place to stand and show up for something. And when I-301 was just getting its footing, my partner at the time, she was involved with the decriminalization effort, and she said to me, "You're Mr. Mushroom. Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you involved?" And it took about 2 months, and I finally said to myself, you know what, I haven't come up with a really good reason not to. So I dipped my toe in the activist space, and it fit like a glove, and here I am today. Community building. Has anybody been to a Denver Mushroom Cooperative meeting here? Cool, thank you. So after we decriminalized mushrooms, we realized that there needed to be a community response to what that looks like so that we could educate people, because once educated, the risk profiles around these things go down to almost nothing. And with community support, especially community support, real healing can be achieved. And what we're finding that if you can only do so much healing as an individual before you need to go to community to be able to embody those teachings. The next area here I have is inspired art. So one of the things I like to do is take the mushrooms through the lost wax process and cast them into bronze. During the lockdown, I had a lot of time to create, and I created all these beautiful bronze representations of the mushrooms, and it gave me an opportunity to kind of show my gratitude in one more way to the medicine. Right before we went into lockdown, I trained to be a death doula. And that sounds pretty far out, but I realized while I was holding space for these or supporting these experiences with individuals, that it's a transitional space. And it just seemed like the next logical thing to dip my toe in. So I went and got trained, and I couldn't actually start working until after some of the limitations had been lifted. But one of the really beautiful things that I was able to kind of like appreciate is if we change the way we die, we change the way we live. And then the last part, religion here. So it seems that within the religious container context, that a lot of these community efforts have a high likelihood of being protected when under federal scrutiny. So one of the things that I went out and did is I co-founded for lack of better word, a religion, to be able to protect some of the thoughts, opinions, and beliefs that I have around the medicine. Socrates. How many people know who Socrates is here? Okay, so Socrates is one of my heroes. And this painting here is a depiction of Socrates is about to drink some hemlock and poison himself, and he was put to death basically for corrupting the youth in Athens. And Socrates, at one point, an oracle said he was the wisest man on earth. And in the quest to understand what that meant, he just started going out and asking questions and asking questions and asking questions to the point where he would reduce things down to their basic elements, and in that he could scrutinize them. And the powers that be didn't like to be scrutinized, so they put him on trial. And essentially, he could have chosen exile, but he would have had to admit that he was wrong. And he was unwilling to admit that he was wrong, and he would rather die than to admit that. And I think that's really beautiful, because this is a theme that haunts us to this day, where the powers that be don't want to be questioned. So it's really wonderful that a person like this has stood the test of time, and he was around 2,400 years ago. And something that's kind of crazy about Socrates is he never wrote anything down. So everything that we know of him is an account from someone else. Speaking of, this is Plato. Plato was one of Socrates' star pupils. And at the time, professional athletes were like the rock stars, much like we have going on today. And Plato came in proximity of Socrates at some point and really started picking up what Socrates was putting down. So after Socrates, his death, Plato emerged as the next person in that lineage of thinking. And I think Plato wrote somewhere in the neighborhood of like 56 books, and Plato wrote in the style of dialogue. So it wasn't just like one person giving a point of view. He added a second person so that you could see a point-counterpoint overview of a lot of these deep insights. So a lot of what gets attributed to Plato is probably, could be attributed to Socrates. Okay, so just so we're all on the same page, this is the only slide I'm actually going to read in its entirety for you here. An allegory is a narrative or visual representation in which a character, place, or event can be interpreted to represent a hidden meaning with moral or political significance. Authors have used allegory throughout history in all forms of art to illustrate or convey complex ideas and concepts in ways that are comprehensible or striking to its viewers, readers, or listeners. So one of the really cool things about this style of creative expression is it allows you to take elements that are user-friendly or things that you know about and arrange them in such a way that things that escape your understanding can kind of be brought into. Plato, one of the many books that Plato wrote was The Republic, and The Republic was an examination of society. And he tackled concepts like truth and beauty and justice, which are not the same to each and every person that contemplates it. Embedded in, I think, Book 7 of The Republic is this allegory of the cave. And how many people are familiar with the allegory of the cave? Cool. So the allegory of the cave depicts what it's like to be shackled in the cave of ignorance and what it's like to leave the cave. So the setup is like this. There's a cave, and in that cave there are prisoners, and they've been there their whole life, and we don't know how they got there, but they're there, and they're chained and they're facing a wall. So this is a really odd setup, but this is all necessary. And behind them is a wall, right here. And then behind that wall is a fire. And in between the fire and the wall is a place where people get up and hold objects in the fire, and the shadows of those objects are cast onto the wall. So all these prisoners ever know of life, their whole life, is looking at these shadows and identifying with them, because that's all they know. One day, one of the prisoners gets escaped or released, I forget exactly which, but they go out, they leave the cave into the sun, and they're blinded by what they see. And at first, when they look down, they recognize shadows from the world from whence they came. But after time, as you know, if you go from somewhere dark to somewhere light, eventually your eyes adjust. And when their eyes started adjusting, they started seeing the 3D forms that were casting these shadows. And in that moment of epiphany, they realized that their whole life, they had only ever been identifying with the shadow of the actual thing that they were perceiving. Given enough time, they were actually able to perceive the sun and see the sun as the source for everything that they were perceiving, even what they were seeing in the cave. So the meat of the allegory is that this person that has escaped the cave goes back into the cave to these prisoners that are still shackled there. And because their eyes had adjusted to the light, they had a really difficult time perceiving the shadows that they used to identify with. And they tried with all their might to impress upon these people that have only ever known these shadows that this is a false representation. There's something actually much bigger with form and light. And because they couldn't perceive the shadows in the same way, the people that were shackled thought that this person was crazy. Thought that they had no idea what they were talking about and were the raving lunatic. And not even just that, but they refused to even consider trying to unshackle themselves to leave the cave. This allegory speaks to the psychedelic experience, to the extent that the people in the cave that have never known the expanded state that psychedelics can offer are limited to what they've been given to identify with. And this little area here, there aren't people depicted in this, but the people that are holding up the object, that can be assumed that those are the people of power that want to basically spoon feed to these people what they want them to perceive. I think this story sounds a little familiar. It's old as time. This is a depiction that I really like because it kind of gives you a whole lay of the land. And there's the people in the cave down here. There's the people of power that are spoon-feeding the people what to believe. And there's these beings right here, these monks here, that kind of like exist in this space where they choose to stay a little bit in the cave to just kind of be those ambassadors to what that world of light is all about. And what I really like here is that you have this like representation of enlightenment. So it's like you can't even begin to appreciate what enlightenment is until you start to undo your shackles and make your way into the world of expansion and light and sound. Any questions so far? Okay. Does everybody know who this guy is? Okay, so Terence McKenna, I could say so many things about him, but one of the things that I really love about him is he is the bard or the orator of the psychedelic space. And his ability to speak poetry about these states and the ability to move laterally through giant bodies of knowledge, of history and sensory experience and lived experience, you know, so he's definitely one of my, I'll say, spirit animals. And he's really important to the story I'm about to tell you because he went out and coined the phrase heroic dose. Little disclaimer here. I advertised about this talk, and I caught a lot of flack from people that pointed out to me that I wasn't sane and a lot of this stuff wasn't safe. So I want to say that like these deep psychedelic spaces are not for everyone. And I'm no expert, and I don't even know how to qualify if someone is ready for these states. But I will tell you that I worked with the mushrooms for 24 years before I started intentionally taking these deep dives. So I already had an appreciation for abstract thinking and how these compounds can bend the rules of reality and our interpretation of them. Does everybody know who this guy is? So Kalindi, I couldn't find birth or death dates for this guy, but he left us about 1.5 years ago, and his contribution to the space is he would take between 30 and 50 grams of mushrooms. And after that experience, he could come back and actually talk about it. And one of the things that he was very generous about talking about was direct experience with the quantum state. And that he really had this deep-seated opinion that the quantum physicists that are theorizing about the nature of our reality, it would benefit them to commune with these psychedelic medicines to have this direct experience. Because it's funny, we walk around with so much intellectualization that the embodiment, the wisdom escapes us. I'll give you a little example. Like, I've never been to Africa, so I'm essentially taking everyone's word for it that it exists. Like, it actually doesn't become real in my experience until I go there and I actually have direct perception. So this man was really pivotal in encouraging me to seek these deep spaces, that there were artifacts, there are things in these deep spaces to bring back that will benefit humanity. And one of the things that we're going to talk about too is the Johns Hopkins studies that have been done for the last 20 years, fruitfully, I might add. I don't know what Roland Griffiths, and that's the head researcher, I don't know exactly what he said to the FDA to convince them to give psilocybin to the dying, but it was powerful enough and it swayed opinion that it initiated these studies. And one of the, I can't help but feel that one of the reasons that we were able to decriminalize mushrooms in Denver is because Johns Hopkins, you know, with all of its provenance, was producing fruitful research. And when you would start talking to people that had a very limited perception of what psilocybin was, when you brought Johns Hopkins into the conversation, they listened. And it was an opportunity to shift that stigma. Okay, so this is a little graph depicting a comparison of the amount of psilocybin taken per individual The Johns Hopkins study participant is around 30 milligrams per 150, 160 pounds. Terence McKenna weighed about 145 pounds, and the mushrooms that he probably used have been now tested by the Oakland Hyphae, so we know that they were about 10 milligrams per gram, or 8 milligrams per gram. So his 5 dried grams arrived us at about 40 milligrams. The mushrooms I grow that I've taken are about twice as potent as that. So some of the experiences that I'm going to talk about today are in the 5-gram range, which takes us to 85 milligrams. And my big doses, I've gone up to about 138 milligrams. Compare that to Kalindi. This guy was taking 440 milligrams. And I think that this is really like important to kind of see this comparison here, because these studies are seeing such efficacy and such huge results at 30 milligrams, but at the opposite end of the spectrum, this guy was like, I mean, I can't even imagine what kind of a warrior it takes to kind of like be in that space, but he was doing it. So this is another comparison that has to do with body weight. The Johns Hopkins studies is approximately 1/4 milligram per kilogram, I think, and right on down the line. So you go from 0.25 to 3.89. This is a magnitude of 40. Magnitude of 40, it's crazy. Okay, so that brings us to my first intentional high dose experience. I said earlier that I've been taking mushrooms for 24 years, and I've taken handfuls before and never really weighed them, and been to some pretty exotic, far out places and seen some things that just like defy the imagination. When we were working on the campaign, Terence McKenna's 5 dried grams kept following me around as this theme that I knew that I felt in my body that it was an eventuality, but I wasn't ready just yet. And coming out of the campaign, I found my life as I knew it collapsing all around me. I was going through an uncoupling process at the end of an 11-year relationship, and I found myself with daily homicidal and suicidal ideation. Now, when I talk about ideation, they weren't things that I was actually going to follow through with, but I was still thinking about this stuff all day long. It was poisoning me. And I kind of just like caved to it. And one day I had my mind made up that I was going to go buy a pack of cigarettes, because I hadn't had a cigarette in 10 years, and I was going to go step in front of a train. And fortunately, I called a suicide hotline, and they got me to agree to one more day. So with that one more day, I had an emergency MDMA therapy session, and it kind of like disarmed my desire to kill or kill myself. And in that space of clarity, I knew it was time to go to the mushroom. Someone had gifted me 5 grams of Cambodian cubensis, and they were so excited. They were so happy and thought that this was such good medicine to share. So before I had any type of ritual process, I cleaned my room, I lit some incense, I made a tea with the 5 grams, and I drank it. And about an hour later, nothing really happened. And now we call that failure to launch. When you get yourself all the courage all set up to do something, and then it kind of just peters out. And I'm not exactly sure why that happened, but it led me to the dose that I think I was supposed to take. So a week later, I came back to that space, and I was going to take 5 grams of the mushrooms that I had grown. And I was really nervous that day, and I reached out to a friend, and I was like, oh man, I'm really nervous. And she said, well, why are you nervous? And I said, I really want to break through. So that's the intention for this journey. And she said, well, why don't you just take more? So in the last year of cultivating, I had grown these 2 mushrooms that together weighed 7.6 grams. And I had them in a jar, and I had them on a top shelf in my closet. And I looked at them and I said, and I really thought like one day that'll be the day, but then all of a sudden today is that day. So I cleaned my room and I burnt some incense and I made a tea, and my partner who I was uncoupling with actually hung out with me during this process. Very nervously, I might add, because we really didn't know what was going to happen. So after I drank the tea, about 45 minutes later, I'm pretty sure I blacked out, because I have no memory with the 39 experiences I've had since then, and kind of like appreciating coming into that space and the things that happened. They weren't there. I totally blacked out. And when I came to, I was being operated on. Has anybody been in a deep state where they feel that the medicine was operating on them? Or there are some very interesting activations? It's kind of like there's no way to really talk about it other than, yeah, there's this element of invasiveness, and they know what they're doing, and there's things happening, and they showed me my chakras. You know, like 10 years ago, I had learned about this system of energy in our bodies. So I had this intellectualization, this intellectual map of what this was. Now, all of a sudden, the medicine is actually giving me a perceptual model of this. And I'm 3 years removed from that experience, but it felt so intuitive. I didn't have to like stretch to understand what was happening. And the first time that I actually heard the mushroom voice, and this has stuck with me, thank you for taking enough so that we could do our job. And that kind of blew me away. So I'm witnessing this process, and one of the other things in this segment that they showed me was that through prana, or intentional breath, I could actually bring healing energy into my chakras. So this is all like, this is wild shit. You know, like I'm just waking up to the reality that these things occur. After that first segment kind of like subsided, I found myself lucid in the space. Like I actually had a little bit of agency. And I don't identify as Christian, but the first thing that I said to the mushrooms or the logos, or however you want to describe it, is, where's Jesus? And the way I talk about it is this, that something that self-identified as Jesus stood before me, or like appeared before me, and said, you of all people, what did you think this was going to be like? Duh. And it's the only thing that my body actually said out loud during that whole experience was, duh. Right? And in that moment, and this is where like some of the allegory of the caves stuff starts to come in, is like, I had a remembrance. I had a memory that I didn't even know that I had forgot. And the feeling was that I had spent more time in that expanded state than I did as a human being, which was radical, you know, and felt so like it didn't have to be argued. You know, it was just accepted. So after I got done hanging out with Jesus, I was like, well, what's Buddha up to? And I had a very similar experience, very remembering, very like, it wasn't foreign feeling. And then I was like, I wonder if I could hang out with my paternal grandfather. And my paternal grandfather had passed away a few years ago, and here I am hanging out with his spirit. And then I had this intuition like, well, I want to hang out with my mom. And my mom's still alive. So I was hanging out with some aspect of her, and the way I like to talk about it is like farther upstream. And then I hung out with Terence McKenna. And all of this seemed completely intuitive and completely like, I didn't need a rationale to allow me to accept this stuff. And the last person that I spent time with in that space was Dennis McKenna. So all of this happened very intuitively, without me having to have a user manual of how to interface with what I call sacred language. While I'm in this transcendent state, I forget that I have a body. And the way that I describe this is, my body had to pee. I felt this feeling. And that is the only reason that I remember that I was even incarnated as a human. I couldn't conceptualize how to get back into my body and how to make it to the bathroom. So So I peed the bed. And I kid you not, it was like these two entities turned to one another and said, oh my God, that was quick. He figured it out. Holy shit. It was like a casino, and the bells and whistles went off. And in hindsight, I really saw that as an act of surrender, that I didn't try and interrupt what was happening to go and, defer somewhere else. So these are some like major points that I took away from that experience. And when I finally came out of it and I came back into my body, I had never felt gratitude in that way for being alive ever before. And considering 5 hours before that, I was suicidal and homicidal, and here I am, grateful to be alive, grateful to my partner for playing her part in like holding that space or doing, just making sure that I had a bucket to throw up in or that I had a hand to hold. So I had never experienced that kind of immense gratitude. And I wanted to go out and prowl into the night and be a creature again. And the medicine had moved so much energy through me, I really couldn't walk. And I was just tired. So I had the opportunity to sit with these insights. And I finally fell asleep after we had to like wash the sheets and stuff. But I finally fell asleep. And when I woke up in the morning around 9 o'clock, I had an email. I had an email from Dennis McKenna. And it wasn't even addressed to me. It was a conversation that he was having with a woman friend of his that was grieving the loss of her father. And she had gone and done some ayahuasca, and she was reporting back to Dennis about her experience. And he had accidentally added my name in the return line. And I was like, well, what the fuck are the chances? So I scrolled down in the conversation, and he asks her, were Peter and Jesus there? And I was like, well, what the fuck are the chances? So does everyone here know what a synchronicity is? Right? A synchronicity and a coincidence are essentially the same thing, same data, but it's the perceiver that sees the what are the chances part. The opportunity to kind of like look further into it. So for all the crazy shit that I had experienced in the journey the night before, that I was just starting to integrate, I felt like I had a physical artifact, this synchronicity, to give me the opportunity to really lean on the experience that I had just had. So fortunately, I didn't have to go too far without having something that rooted my experience in reality. Show me the deepest and most expanded aspect of myself. So this is the second big dose that I took about 60 days apart from the first one. This story begins at Paul Stamets' farm. So I was at Paul Stamets' farm learning how to do some commercial cultivation stuff, and I met a gentleman from Iowa that was there to learn how to remediate pig shit, because in Iowa they have all these pig farms and they don't know what to do with the waste. So he really believes that there's a solution in the mushrooms. So I connected with this other guy, Paul, because he's been practicing Kriya Yoga for 42 years. Does everybody know what Kriya is? So it's a spiritual practice that predates religion. And I had really not met or encountered anyone that practiced Kriya, so it was a really cool connection to have. And I guess I impressed him enough that he went back to Iowa and he told one of his best friends about me. So this person that he told about me, his name's Mahesh, and he's now one of my mentors. And Mahesh reached out to me and we started corresponding. And I realized very quickly that Mahesh knew a lot about enlightenment. He'd been meditating for 42 years, and in the last couple years, he'd been working very diligently with mushrooms and really taking a lot of this wisdom that he'd accumulated over 40 years and started beginning to, through perceptual models, being able to embody this stuff. So this is really the right kind of person that I was looking to talk to contextualize some of my really deep abstract experiences. I was receiving an award in Pittsburgh at a psychedelic conference, and Mahesh lives in Fairfield, Iowa, so I had to drive through Fairfield to get to Pittsburgh. So I decided to stop there and allow him to facilitate a journey for me. So one of the things that I bring into my work is this kind of like work that I can do on myself to benefit the collective. I'm always kind of like looking outside myself and utilizing myself as an agent to be able to help other people. So the first intention that I brought to him is that I wanted to be an ambassador for hyperspace. I think is that how I kind of phrased it. And through a few iterations, we finally arrived at a place that to help the collective, I needed to help myself. So my intention was whittled down to show me the deepest and most expanded aspect of myself. So I asked Mahesh, I said, well, what's the most amount you've ever taken? And he said 9 grams. And I said, well, I want to do 10. So within an hour and a half of actually physically meeting this person, I subjected myself to this deep space. And another instance of after taking the medicine, I'm pretty sure that I like blacked out or passed out. And I think that some of these experiences accelerate so quickly that that's kind of like the body's reaction to kind of like, it's almost like a trauma response in a way that you dissociate from it. But when I came to, I found myself in a seemingly infinite library with ornate wooden shelves that just seemed to extend into infinity. And I had never been in proximity of the infinite, and for it being such like a hard thing to conceptualize, all of a sudden I was not only in the proximity of the infinite, but I was calm. That the deliberateness, the feeling of all things have been realized, the lack of tension, from mind wanting to know, it was all gone. And the bulk of my experience was just being in this space. And then the medicine encouraged me to root my consciousness there and showed me that if I just sit and think about it and breathe into that I could revisit this deep expanded state. Let's see what else I want to say about that. Oh, one of the other things that came from the medicine really wanted me to extend deep gratitude to the person that had just held space for my experience, and wanted me to tell him that his whole life of applying himself to discipline and learning all this stuff was not only important to his experience, but crucial in being able to hold specifically this experience. So I came out of that with a message from the deep to communicate to this human being that had just shown up in my experience, how much that meant. 2 days later, I found myself at the conference in Pittsburgh, and I met Kalindi for the first time. And I had been making eye contact with Kalindi for a day and a half, and I finally got up enough guts to go talk to him. And he's a really big dude. He's like 250 pounds, and he practices martial arts, and he's just so rooted in assurance. And I was like, I just did 10 grams, and he literally looked right through me, and he was like, cool story. And I felt very as so proud of myself that I realized that I was just starting at the base of this mountain. And later that day, Kalindi spoke, and he spoke about the Akashic Records. Does everybody know what the Akashic Records are? So it's essentially the sum total of human experience. And I kid you not, that's where the medicine had dropped me, in the Akashic field. And the way they portrayed it was this library. And I knew that when I was hearing him speak that I was having this resonance, this sympathetic vibration with that information. So again, the medicine experience wasn't limited to the container of actually being in the medicine. It was actually spilling over into the physical. So much like my first experience where I had this email from Dennis McKenna, I now had a physical landmark to be able to root my experience in. So I was starting to realize that once you visit these expanded states, they're always with you. Okay, fast forward to last fall. I had been fortunate enough to not catch COVID for a long time. And one of my protocols was to take functional mushrooms, a lot of them. And I took Reishi, and there are a few studies that are out there, very small pilot studies, with like 10 people, that make the assertion that the Reishi doesn't allow viruses to attach. But because these studies aren't super well funded, we don't have these large numbers of people being tested to support these hypotheses. Last fall, a friend of mine who's a Reishi farmer for 10 years now and hasn't been sick for 10 years was in Denver for the GEM show. And we were swapping stories about the entheogenic work, and he was telling me that the Reishi he really felt was communicating to him that we could introduce DNA to the mycelium, and through introducing DNA to the mycelium that they would somehow make a cocktail for the individual. So we could actually work with these mushrooms to make custom tailored medicines for the individual. So in that conversation, I had remembered years ago hearing about these ethnopharmacologists or ethnobotanists, which is essentially what Terence McKenna was, going down to the Amazon, and they would meet these people that worked with ayahuasca, and they would say, "You humans have only been here for X amount of years. How do you know so much about all these plants?" And they just kept telling them, "The ayahuasca told us." Like, duh. And so I've been sitting with that for years. So in this conversation, I was wondering, do you think it'd be possible to communicate to the Reishi through the psilocybin? And I'm a mad scientist. I don't know if you've picked up on that, but I felt really called to go into the space with the Reishi. So my friend gave me 4 months of Reishi tincture, and I boiled off all the alcohol, and I drank the Reishi tincture along with 5 grams of freeze-dried penis envy, which is the strain that I grow, which is about 80 milligrams of psilocybin. One thing that struck me right away, when I take higher doses especially, there's a first wave of things that kind of kick in that I refer to as like the doormen, or like the first tryptamines that kind of show up. And it's not as prevalent when you take lower doses, but they're very well defined from each different type of mushroom. And this time the doormen were completely influenced by the Reishi, and I could tell. So as soon as I drop into the space, the Reishi starts communicating to me in Japanese, which threw me for a loop because I'm always talking about Reishi through the traditional Chinese medicine lens. And in hindsight, I realized that the word Reishi is Japanese. The second thing, the psilocybin's always kind enough to give me a very elaborate perceptual model about the things that I'm inquiring about, because I guess it appreciates that that's how I learn things, is through perceptual models. And the Reishi didn't do that. It said, as long as you take me, I got this. It's very cut and dry, and the word that I like to use is curt. It's just right to the point. And then the next thing that it left me with was, it encouraged me to go out and find a Japanese naturopath doctor, which I thought was pretty left field. And I still haven't followed up with that part of my homework, but I thought that was really odd. So that was the first half of the journey. And then the second half of the journey was really interesting. I guess we don't always consider, we have our doingness and we have our beingness. And the things that we do are influenced directly by our state of being. So our hands become these agents of our doingness. And the medicine had me apologize to my hand for every messed up thing I ever made it do. And I went through all of these obscure memories of like when I was in grade school, and this girl that I was in class with had bragged about all this cash that she had on her. So while the whole school was at an assembly, I snuck away and I went and I stole money out of this girl's purse. Eventually I got caught for it because I blabbed about it, but I hadn't thought about that in 30 years. So as I'm apologizing to my hand, I'm realizing that my hand was actually traumatized by this. And I could feel all of these memories, these traumas being released from my hand. And normally when I take a dose that big, I'm usually in for about 5 hours, and I was out in 3. Out in 3 without even any like geometrical distortion or anything like that. So the Reishi, I also think, accelerated the metabolism of the medicine. Okay, the last one I'm going to talk about, if that wasn't weird, this is weird. We were going to have a monthly meeting on mushrooms and death for the co-op. And we were going to have an individual get up there and share some lived experiences with working with the medicine with people on their deathbed. And someone with some legal insight got involved with the conversation and said, "That's not defensible. Don't do that. In fact, you shouldn't do it and the co-op shouldn't do it. That's not defensible." So another person on the board said, "Well, we'll just find somebody else that works in palliative care to give the talk." And the initial person that was going to give the talk said, "No, we were told not to do this." So this became a huge point of contention within the board of, well, this is coming up in a week, so what are we going to do? And I said to myself, I'm going to go ask the mushrooms. And I didn't really tell anybody about it. And there's actually somebody sitting in the room today that was with me for this experience. So I had this belief that I was going to take 5 grams and I was going to sit up and I was just going to channel all this stuff to speak to the co-op. But it wasn't like that. The mushrooms, the first part of the journey is that they showed me how to be with death. And one thing that I didn't realize is how much I look away from death. That I just like, it's like too much. And the medicine allowed me to sit with the most uncomfortable shit ever. The death of the planet, the death of my marriage, the death of my aging dog. All of these things that I didn't want to I wanted to bypass in the moment, I was then forced to actually be with. And then I purged. I purged a lot. And I didn't ever purge before taking higher doses of psilocybin. I've gotten nausea from the mushrooms themselves, but never when I say purge, it's more than throwing up. You can actually feel, it's almost like an exorcism, like something energetically is leaving your body. And working in this space, I see people either throw up, or they cry, or they talk, or they move. But there's these purgatory mechanisms that allow us to disengage and release this stuff. So in that purging, it created a lot of space and an opportunity for deep listening. And the second part of that journey, the mushrooms gave me this somatic imprint, or this feeling in my body of deep assurance. And they basically relayed to me that nature, in its infinite wisdom, in its deep knowing, kind of looks at all the atrocious shit that we're doing, and with the smallest little grin, knows that this is all part of it, that eventually we're going to come back to the fold, and they're anticipating that return. So I had this really deep imprint of assurance. So I decided to co-lead that talk with the person that was in the room with me, and we ran a dialogue. And what was transmitted in that dialogue was so powerful. It was definitely one of the most beautiful co-op meetings we had ever had. And for all the hostility that had emerged in how are we going to shift gears with this talk, both of those parties reconciled because it was just so powerful in what was transmitted. I was criticized because some people didn't think that was a very professional thing to do. It's to go to the medicine and ask the medicine what to do. But I kid you not, with the relationship that I've had with the medicine, it seemed like it was the most intuitive and made the most sense. Let's back up. Okay, we're not over yet. So some of the things that I've talked about today really kind of like are pretty out there. And I'm really blessed and fortunate to be able to have a space like this of receptivity to be able to introduce a lot of these things into. And one thing that I learned is once I committed to the path, that things were just going to get stranger. You know, I hate to look at numbers and metrics and stuff like this, but at first, I was really, I think with the big doses, really trying to commit some form of suicide because I knew in some deep place that there was more than the trappings of my programming, but I didn't yet know how to articulate that. I hadn't yet been around people that had been in these deep states and had this wisdom. So a lot of this was me feeling around in the dark to establish some firm footing and to develop a language between me and the medicine. So oftentimes in these states, it's not actually English that I'm speaking. It's what I like to call the sacred language, or it's pure intuition. And in that state of pure intuition, the most unbelievably complex things can be communicated and appreciated and understood. I wasn't really sure what kind of a survey of experiences to talk about, so I tried to talk about things that kind of like delved into a few different areas of how we can communicate with these great teachers. And some commentary on the current landscape of legislation that's coming down the pipeline is I think that a lot of times when people start to work with these medicines, they feel that they've arrived at a place of understanding. And a poem that I like to reference is about these 6 blind men that go visit an elephant. Is anyone familiar with that poem? So these 6 blind men go visit an elephant and they all wind up at different parts of the elephant. One finds the tail and he's like, oh, this has got a long handle and this has got a brush, so this must be a paintbrush. And the other guy comes to the leg and he's feeling around it and he goes to the ground and he's like, oh, this must be a tree trunk. So in their limited perception, they're right, but they're actually missing out on a bird's eye view of what's going on. And I think that reductive kind of way of looking at things is harmful because it speaks to the mind's desire to arrive at a place of conclusion. And one thing that I've realized with these medicines in this process is that there is no conclusion. It just keeps going. And a lot of these experiences now have been this great delayering of my programming. And one thing that I will tell you is that it's each individual's responsibility to address that programming. And nothing outside of you can actually do that work for you. So I really encourage you to step into sovereignty around these medicines. And don't put your faith in the people that say they have the answers. I think my whole life I've distrusted kind of everything, and for good reason. And working with the medicine has given me an opportunity to have something in my life that to the extent that I can trust, I do. So it's really beautiful that in this world of subjectivity, of these multiple truths that exist, to be able to go to a place, a source of this much deeper wisdom and commune with it. And the more respect and the more humility that you take to these beings, the more that will be rendered asunder onto you. I think I'm going to take questions at this point. What time is it? Time check. Questions?
Can you tell us more about being a death doula and how people can get involved?
Okay. So there's an organization called INELDA, which does trainings. INELDA. So the gentleman that founded INELDA was a birth doula and was like, well, why don't we have death doulas? Because this is just as important of a transitional space. And I went to the training, and after the second night, we pulled them aside, and a friend of mine and I were there, and we let them know that we had worked on mushroom decriminalization, and they were so excited because the statistic that they gave me at the time is that 85% of people, when they're really close, they question everything. And even the most religious people, the most strictly religious people, fall to pieces and aren't assured to transition from that space. So they were excited to have these medicines as part of the toolkit to be able to alleviate the existential dread. And the body knows how to die. So if we just take away around those fears around that transition or what comes next, or give the person the opportunity to address some unresolved things, then they can actually transition a lot smoother. So I took the training, and I didn't actually get involved on a case for 2 years later. And I only work with people that want to work with the medicine as well. But it's all, people found me through word of mouth, just knowing that I talk about this and I do it. And I started getting cases just through word of mouth. So I haven't taken the medicine with them yet. There's a little bit of, I don't want to say it, I guess I'm waiting for the medicine to tell me that it's okay to start doing that as well. But yes, either microdosing, or if I feel that they can handle a journey, to be able to take them into the journey space. Thank you. Yes?
With your heroic doses, are you doing anything other than lighting incense and setting your room, or your place, like with your body? Are you fasting?
Okay, my rituals. You're asking about my rituals. So the mushrooms at one point told me it's not what you do, it's that you do it. And the way that I've interpreted that is ritual is an opportunity to humble yourself and distinguish that space from the rest of your life. Like, this space is different. This is not regular everyday life. This I'm coming to with humility, with receptivity. So a lot of times I'll clean my space, really like physically clean it. And the incense is still part of it. I've kind of shifted from the incense I was using to more traditional things like copal, palo santo, stuff like that. I found that with high doses, that the body has demands that fasting complicates. So that there's calories that you actually need. There's been several times in a high dose experience where my electrolytes crashed, and the medicine's like, you need to get electrolytes. And then after taking electrolytes, then the experience proceeds. So one of the things that they did thank me for was being vegetarian. And when I went down to Oaxaca and actually participated in a more traditional ceremony, you don't eat meat before you go into the experience. So I would say eat really clean, because one of the things these medicines do is detox us. And one of the things that the mushrooms has really challenged me on is that a lot of times I'll show up and I won't be clean, and they'll have to do the work of detoxing me, and they really don't like that. That's disrespectful. So I would say eat clean. If you can spend time away from everybody else, just like silence and cloistering yourself. I think that all of these, because you wind up taking debris, if you want to call it that, into the space. So anything that you can do to kind of show reverence or respect, and kind of think about this is your opportunity for artistic expression as part of the conversation with the medicine. Did I answer your question?
So, how long do these journeys typically take to recover from? And how did you get other shit done during this time?
Okay, so I'm still recovering from I want to break through. What happens is we have these deep-seated beliefs, and the medicine just dismantles them, right? So like once you actually have to like sit with that, if you don't have support, or you don't have people to talk this over, or like people that have kind of been in that space, those types of spaces that you're asking about can really elongate themselves. You know, it's like, it's important to have practices that like re-embody ourselves, that re-ground us, that kind of like allow us to calm down, you know? And so I would say that after a huge dose, it takes me about 60 days for my nervous system to kind of like finally just like settle, and for the experience, the bulk of it, to finish unpacking itself, because these experiences are so dense that sometimes it takes weeks for them to unfold. And then you have real life experiences that kind of echo what you just experienced, and something will come and say, look, this is like this. This is like this. So to answer your question, it can take a while. And you know, like I really see community as being the ultimate medicine. You know, and a lot of these regulations that are coming down the pipeline, I don't know how community is going to be achieved when you pay to go see someone and you can only get their time and attention when you pay them. That's the reciprocation. Everybody that I work with becomes family to me. You know, if someone wants to call me at 10 o'clock at night and they're wrestling with something, like I'm available to do that. You know, and I just really see that there's no one size fits all. So to answer your question, each situation is unique, especially to the depths where the medicine is applied. You know, sometimes I've had experiences where the medicine gets applied to my 3-year-old self. So that has, you know, like 39 years of reconciliation that takes time.
So how do you heal yourself during this?
Get enough sleep. Nourish yourself. Meditate. You know, it's really difficult to just sit and be with yourself. But thousands of years ago, some human beings figured out if we just do that, and we keep doing that, and we keep doing that, then we become receptive to very deep, inherent wisdom. So meditation, more so than a lot of things, to me is the greatest tool of integration. Any other questions? Okay, how mindfulness helps with the psychedelic experience. Most of the time we're in a reactive state. We don't even realize it. When we look at our phone, we forget that we have a body. That's how quick and easy it is. We are subtly, because we're not rooted in assurance in our experience, all of us to some degree are in a shade of fight or flight. Because we have a belief system that makes us think that we got it, but at the end of the day, like I was talking about people on their deathbed, that assurance really isn't there. So one thing that's really cool about mindfulness is it allows you to detach from projection, from story, from anticipating a future that hasn't happened yet, or lamenting about a past that you can't do anything about. And it brings you back into your body, and it brings you into the here and now. And I kid you not, the more time that you spend in the here and now, then these things, these insights can present themselves and allow you to integrate and then ultimately demonstrate them. So by staying mindful, it keeps you with the wisdom of these experiences in a way that we get distracted so easy. Our attention just like, we just go. We're like, oh, shiny thing. And we forget like, oh, no, we have a body, we're human, we're having an experience. And I think that it also helps us to work through what could be psychological breaks. Are we done? Are we done? All right. Okay. Does that answer your question? Any other questions? Yes.
What would be the 3 most important things you would want to bring awareness to before someone heading from the road?
3 things of awareness. Love whatever comes up. Sometimes the medicine shows us the scariest shit ever, right? But it wants to be seen. It wants to be noticed. Love it, which may seem counterintuitive, but damn, that's one of the things that saved me. The second thing I would say is ask for hidden wisdom. You know, why am I being showed this? You know, like, and I think that arrives me at the third thing. So we'll kind of merge those together. Appreciate that the medicine is going to meet you at the place of resistance. So sometimes we don't get what we think we're going to get. We get something completely different. It's like one of those things where, like, you don't always get what you want, but you get what you need. So I would say those three things. Love whatever comes up, ask for its hidden wisdom, and where's the last one? What was the last one? What's that?
Need it.
Need it? Is that what I said?
Have the medicine meet you.
Oh, that the medicine meets you at the place of resistance, which for the most part is unconscious. You know, these medicines allow us to access things that if I sat here and really thought about something that I'm like, why is this triggering me? Why is this triggering me? My mind might find a place, oh yeah, right, and I'd be content to sit there, but the medicine actually opens up the subconscious and allows that unconscious to become conscious. And when the unconscious becomes conscious, then intelligence can become intelligent. That's it. Thank you.